Console killer PC builds used to be a thing on YouTube, right up until the 9th generation happened. Granted, that was a pretty bad time to find any kind of tech, but even in a perfect world without rampant scalping, the original PS5 was untouchable in terms of value. The PS5 Pro, however, is offering just 45% more performance for 80% more money than the base model, and the PC market is a lot more accessible than it was back in 2020. While the original PlayStation 5 was unkillable, I think we have a good shot at this new version. This video was brought to you by FlexiSpot and their C7 ergonomic chair. I've been using my C7 for 4 months now, and I can confidently say it's the best, most comfortable and supportive office chair I've ever sat in. Which might not be saying much, as in the past I have had a tendency towards buying the cheapest ones on Amazon. Seriously though, I suffer from sciatica as the result of a slipped disc, and sitting in uncomfortable chairs for hours on end, editing videos, is the bane of my existence. I chose the mesh version, which is not only comfortable and supportive, but breathable, meaning I don't find myself getting all swampy during extended editing or benchmarking sessions. The chair is fully reclining up to 128 degrees with a height and tilt adjustable headrest and self-adjusting lumbar support, which is perfect for supporting my elderly, fragile spinal cord. With 3D adjustable armrests, adjustable seat depth and height that let you get your C7 into the perfect position for work, you can also use the optional retractable footrest to sit back and game as nature intended. Of course, if you don't fully trust random influencers on the internet, and hey, good for you. FlexiSpot offers 30-day returns, so you can try the C7 risk-free, and if you're not 100% satisfied, you can return it. Then come along to my comments section and call me a filthy liar and a charlatan. FlexiSpot are currently offering special Black Friday discounts, and you can get an extra $50 off with the code on screen. Thanks again to FlexiSpot for sponsoring the video, as well as the nice comfy office chair. A couple weeks ago, I put together a gaming PC for people who were disappointed by the new PS5 Pro. It could do everything the console did, just a little bit better, and still fits into the console-style environment. However, it was a touch on the expensive side. I think some people expected a console killer, so this time, that's exactly what I've built. Okay, for clarity, I have to state the obvious. Consoles are great. You can't beat them for convenience. They're the last bastion of physical media, and I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't exist. One day, I might even buy one for myself. Console killer is a concept for PC fans who want something that's just as capable or possibly even better than a console for the same money or even less. It's certainly not going to be as convenient as a console, and it's not going to be as small either. And while I'm trying to keep as many new components in the build as possible, it's also going to have to involve some older components that might only be available on the used market. On the other hand, it's not going to be hamstrung by the limitations of the console platform, and it won't be left completely high and dry in 4 years' time when the PS6 comes out. Starting with the GPU, the 12GB GeForce RTX 3080 seemed like the best option for a PS5 Pro killer. In reality, it's probably close to double the performance of the regular PS5 and has advantages in other areas too. It's certainly more than double the PS5 in terms of ray tracing performance and has access to DLSS upscaling. The PS5 Pro has Pissa, which is their own AI-powered upscaling tech that seems to do the same job, but it looks like the Nvidia version still has an advantage in many areas. The 12GB VRAM buffer of the 3080 is a bit lower than what's available to the PS5 Pro, so we'll have to hope that Nvidia's apparently excellent memory management will mean we can still match console settings without running out of memory. The only other downsides to the 3080 are 1. It's consuming 300 watts or more of power, and 2. It's consuming half my budget for this build. I paid £380 for mine a couple of months ago, and while eBay pricing can fluctuate a bit, it looks like the price hasn't changed much in that time. Viable alternatives might be the RX 6800 or 6800 XT from AMD, or the 7800 XT if you prefer to buy brand new, but they might fall short in terms of ray tracing ability and don't currently have a really good answer to PISA. The RTX 4070 and 4070 Super also fit the bill, so if you can't find a good deal on the 3080, they might be the best alternative. For a CPU, I went with the Intel i5-12400F. At just £100 or $110 brand new, it's a pretty stunning buy right now, but there are a ton of great alternatives you could consider if, for some reason, you don't much want to buy into the LGA 1700 platform. The AMD Ryzen 5600 is a similar price and similarly capable, or you could also consider the Ryzen 5 7500F, which is my personal favourite budget gaming CPU and can be bought on AliExpress for about the same price. But that means spending more on DDR5 RAM. For a second-hand option, I'd recommend at least an AMD 3700X or an Intel i7 8700K or i5 10600K, as I think the PS5 Pro's relatively weak CPU isn't an excuse for having a weak CPU in a console killer. The problem, of course, is that these are still fairly expensive. The 3700X isn't much cheaper on the used market than a 5600 or 12400F, and although it has more cores, the new chips have stronger per-core performance and will be significantly better in most games. Plus, neither of them needs much in the way of cooling. To save money, I'm using the stock Intel heatsink that I got free with my CPU, whereas older, high-end used CPUs often don't come with coolers, and usually need something a bit more substantial anyway. An H610, B660 or B760 motherboard can be had for around £75 or $70 to $80 brand new, and a B450 or B550 board could be a similarly priced option for the Ryzen alternative. I'm using a Z690 DDR4 board, which I already had on hand and only paid £100 for, but there's no advantage to it in this context, and you don't need to waste money on a Z chipset. Going for a DDR4 motherboard means we get to save money on RAM too. I spent a grand total of £8 on some used sticks from my local CEX, but you can get 16GB brand new for around $25 to $35. Storage is a personal preference. A 2TB NVMe drive is about £90 to £100 right now, and about the same in dollars, but if you want to save some money you can buy what you need now and expand later. For power, although total system consumption is around 450 watts, you're better off looking for something a bit more substantial. I'm using an EVGA 750W GQ I bought about 8 years ago for a price I can't quite recall, but a new 700W model from a reasonably reliable brand will cost in the region of £50 to £75 or dollars. Finally, again, the case is a matter of personal preference and will often be dictated by the size of the other components you've bought. I'm just building on a motherboard box, but you can get a basic ATX case for £35 easily enough. Just make sure you measure your graphics card before you pick your case. Depending on what you've bought, you should probably be somewhere around the £700 to £750 or dollar mark at this point, or perhaps as high as £900 if you've gone for a new graphics card. Arguably, that's the cost of the console plus an optical drive and a year of PlayStation Plus. Regardless, this is somewhere in the ballpark of what a gamer would pay for a new PS5 Pro, but does it perform like one? Starting with Ratchet & Clank, I decided to go with settings that I think are probably pretty close to those being used on the PS5 Pro. I'm using the very high preset with quality DLSS and high RT reflections, and the results are okay, not stellar. The console killer manages a healthy 70fps average, but there are a few frame drops. This isn't uncommon in this game on any GPU I've tested, even the 20GB RX 7900 XT, but the PC I built for the previous video managed to run the same settings with over 25% higher 1% lows. Meanwhile, God of War Ragnarok not only performs as well as it did on the RTX 4070 system, it actually goes a frame or so higher. The average at 4K Ultra with DLSS quality is 69 FPS. Even the 1% lows are about a frame higher, so we're only a couple of occasional drops away from a locked 60 FPS experience. The story's similar in Horizon Forbidden West, if not a little better. This time the 3080 scores a couple more frames than the 4070 did at the estimated PS5 Pro equivalent settings, averaging over 67 FPS at 4K very high with DLSS quality, and with 1% lows of 48. Black Myth Wukong delivered some very interesting results. My 30 FPS fidelity mode for the 4070 system was 4K very high with 50% DLSS and medium RT. And I stuck with that on this PC too, even though the PS5 Pro probably won't have path tracing as an option. The 3080 scored 37 FPS compared to 43 on the newer card with the better CPU, and even dropping DLSS to 33% still shows an advantage to the newer system. Maybe not all that surprising when I put it that way, but what is surprising is that when path tracing is turned off for performance mode, the balance completely flips, and the 3080 scores about 20% higher. A similar thing happens in Alan Wake 2, though arguably neither setup's great for path tracing here. The 3080 machine only manages 25 FPS at DLSS performance, compared to barely 30 FPS on the 4070. I know it's not a particularly action-heavy game, and if you're using a controller it makes these slower frame times a lot more bearable, but I still think these are too much. As in BMW, the performance mode settings with RT disabled are even better on the older setup, though by a much smaller margin of about 8%. Forza Motorsport? Yeah, I know, but this is a fairly high-end system, and Horizon 5 just isn't challenging enough. Forza Motorsport once again seems to like the 3080 just a little bit better than the 4070. The near 80 FPS average in the built-in benchmark is about 10% higher than the previous PC managed at those same settings, though the 1% lows seem to suffer a little, probably due to the weaker CPU, but still managing to stay over 60 FPS. I don't know what it is about Starfield, but I keep getting spookily similar results from different hardware. This time the average from the RTX 3080 is 0.1 frames higher than the average from the RTX 4070, and the 1% low is exactly the same. I'm not one for conspiracy theories, but for all the people who've been shouting at the screen about a CPU bottleneck from the i5, you're finally right. The city of Baldur's Gate is too much for the poor 12400F. The GPU is frequently only being utilised at about half its potential, and while the 53 FPS average might look okay and only about 15% or so below the console PC, the sub-30 1% lows just go to show how poor the experience is. You're definitely better off looking at 30 FPS in this one, which I'm sure will still be tolerable given the turn-based combat. One I didn't feature in the previous video, Jedi Survivor is a game that still stresses out CPUs, even after all the patches and the removal of de novo. I'm not doing myself any favours by testing with RT enabled, but while the average makes it look like this PC can handle it, the 1% lows tell a different story. Black Ops 6 definitely seems to prefer the 4070's newer architecture. My quality preset for the previous video averaged over 80 FPS and only dipped slightly below 60, whereas the 3080 averages 67 and lows drop as far as 46. Even my performance mode is only just over 110 FPS compared to over 130 on the 4070. I have to admit, I'm pleasantly surprised by the results. Given the weaker CPU and older GPU choice compared to the last build, I lowered my expectations. In a couple of instances, notably those involving path tracing or heavy CPU usage, the cheaper system falls behind a little, but for the most part it's still pretty playable. Most impressively, there are almost as many occasions where this $750 PC has a slight edge over the more expensive one. If we were aiming for an esports experience, the story might be different. The 7800X3D would have a clear advantage in CS2 at 1080p, for example, but for the most part, the i5 holds up pretty well at console-esque settings. Outside of the context of killing consoles for sport, does this build really make sense? Actually, yeah, I think it does. The RTX 3080 still has a future ahead of it, thanks to relatively strong performance and DLSS for when that isn't enough. When I last tested this GPU, I had a bunch of people telling me I was holding it back by not pairing it with a 7800X3D. When I paired the 4070 with a 7800X3D, I got a different bunch of people telling me it was a waste of money. Both are true statements. There are clearly cases where this PC would do better with a CPU upgrade, especially Baldur's Gate 3. However, I don't think you'll be missing out on much if you can't afford a 12900K right now. As much as we all say LGA 1700 is a dead platform now that 1851 is a thing, and most of the 13th and 14th generation K-series CPUs are best steered clear of, there are still ways you can extend the life of this system. For one thing, DDR4 is pretty cheap right now, so upgrading to 32GB shouldn't stretch the budget too much. I'm working on an even cheaper console killer build than this, using a pre-built PC as the platform. However, I'm going to wait for some more data about what difference the PS5 Pro architecture makes in ray tracing before I settle on a graphics card, so that might have to wait for the new year. Thanks again to FlexiSpot for sponsoring the video. Check out their Black Friday deals on the C7 ergonomic chair at the link below, or their brand new, even fancier C7 Max, with 5D armrests for presumably travelling through interdimensional space. I'm sure they would have sent me a Max if they'd had any going spare at the time. No need to feel bad about it, guys. I don't take it personally. Don't forget to use the discount code on screen for an extra $50 off your purchase. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.